This paper, published by Leo Kanner in 1943, represents the earliest academic reference to autism as a developmental disorder and states there are a number of children whose condition differs so markedly and uniquely from anything reported so far that each case merits, and I hope will eventually receive, a detailed consideration of its fascinating peculiarities. Well, Leo, it's been 82 years and there has indeed been a detailed consideration of its fascinating peculiarities. Hey, just to quickly tell you about this week's sponsor. Absolutely nobody, because this channel's really small, but I'm trying to grow, so please consider subscribing. Back to the video. Let's make a little timeline here. This is 1911, with the earliest reference to autism when Eugene Bleuler used the word to characterize a symptom of schizophrenia. 1943 is when our friend Leo Kanner published the paper we just looked at. Just a year later, Hans Asperger reported on children who had significant social impairment and restricted interests, but average or high intelligence, later to be termed Asperger's syndrome. It was only by the 1970s that Sir Michael Rutter distinguished and clarified that autism is distinct from schizophrenia. 1977 saw the first evidence that autism is something that can be inherited from parents, which shifted the focus towards the biology and the neurodevelopmental nature of autism. 1980 was the first time autism was formally recognized in the psychiatric manual, the DSM-3, which included infantile autism as a developmental disorder. In 1994, the DSM-4 expanded this categorization to include autistic disorder, Asperger's syndrome, and something called PDD-NOS, pervasive development disorder not otherwise specified, Rett syndrome, and childhood disintegrative disorder. Even with this expansion, this version of the DSM included the word autism only 9 times. This changed in 2013 when the new DSM-5 was published, which merged all these previously mentioned terms into a single umbrella diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. This latest version, the DSM-5, mentions the word autism 187 times, an excellent improvement over the previous version. A reminder, this video is for educational purposes and to raise awareness, it's not a means of diagnosis. The diagnosis of autism is based on observation of behaviour alone, not blood tests, brain scans or genetics. There are 5 diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder. Criteria A is deficits in social communication. Criteria B is restricted or repetitive patterns of interest. Criteria C is symptoms must be present in early development. Criteria D is the symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational or other important areas of functioning. And criteria E is that A through D are not better explained by intellectual disability. Once a diagnosis of autism is made using the behavioural criteria, clinicians can add specifiers to each criteria, like whether there's also an intellectual disability, a language delay, or a known genetic or neurodevelopmental condition, which helps describe the individual's specific profile more accurately. The thing that is perhaps missed in these clinical diagnostic criteria is that autism can be viewed as a different way the brain processes social information. There's something called theory of mind, which is essentially the ability to understand that other people have their own thoughts, feelings and perspectives, even if you disagree with them. A man called Simon Baron-Cohen showed that many people with autism find this skill harder to develop or use intuitively, which can make reading social cues harder. But here's the key thing. What in the brain actually causes an individual to have the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder? Well, this can be looked at from 3 main perspectives: genetics, neurobiology, and neuroimaging. There are 2 types of genetic contributions, syndromic and non-syndromic autism spectrum disorder. Syndromic is where autism is part of a broader genetic syndrome. The other type of genetic contribution is non-syndromic, which is the majority of autism cases where no single genetic cause fully explains the condition. Instead, the literature discusses something called polygenic influences, where many genetic changes contribute to the risk of a person having autism. Everything we are, or are not, is a mixture of genes and our environment. So something like height is about 90% genes and 10% your environment. This Danish study, published in 2017, followed over 2 million births across 5 countries and found that about 80% of the risk for autism comes from genetics. That means, like height, autism is mostly driven by inherited factors, with the remaining 20% or so linked to environmental influences before or after birth. There's also research investigating the effect of perinatal injury shortly before, during, or after birth. This study, published in Nature Medicine this year actually, followed 1.1 million births in Denmark and investigated 236 conditions during the pregnancy for a link to autism. Did the mum have flu or a broken bone or depression? And things like that. At first, many illnesses and injuries look connected to autism, for example, certain infections or fractures during pregnancy. But most of these links actually disappeared when researchers included data of the participants' siblings who didn't have autism. This showed that shared family genetics and environment were often the real explanation rather than the pregnancy condition itself, which is helpful to discount perinatal injury to a large extent. Not totally, but to a large extent. But it doesn't get us any closer to any concrete answers. But here is something that does. The genetic changes observed in people with autism affect the formation of different components of the cells in the brain and body. So if this is a strand of DNA here, and these parts in red are the genetic changes in a person, these genetic changes directly affect this crucial structure, a synapse that exists between 2 brain cells. These brain cells communicate with chemicals called neurotransmitters in a carefully controlled way. The genetic changes we see in polygenic autism may affect synapses. There are more than 100 trillion synapses in the human brain. This is strong evidence that some of these structures inside the synapse are potentially not produced correctly in people with autism. An example of this is something called neurexins and neuroligands. These are 2 little structures that work together to align and stabilize this synapse. This paper from 2022 describes how 5% of autism spectrum disorder cases are caused by mutations to the genes that code for the neurexins and the neuroligands, which disrupts their function. By no means does this explain all autism cases, but it highlights just one example of how genetic changes cause changes to the biology of the brain that affects its overall function and can produce the diagnostic criteria for autism. Another method for controlling the vast differences in people with autism spectrum disorder is twin studies that allow for the control of genetic and environmental factors to a far greater extent. In this fascinating study, they recruited 87 pairs of twins with various combinations of neurotypical and neurodivergent presentations. Significantly, 16 were discordant, where one twin had a diagnosis of autism and the other was neurotypical. They gave them an MRI machine, which can take these beautiful detailed pictures of your brain using magnets and analyze the data. They found that twins with autism had weaker connections between their brainstem and a part of their brain called the cuneus. The cuneus is involved in visual processing, which suggests that basic visual information is processed differently in people with autism. Also, the twins with more autistic traits had weaker connections between the hippocampus, involved in memory processing, and the fusiform gyrus, which processes faces, and the parahippocampal gyrus, crucial for memory and spatial processing, i.e., how your body interacts with the objects around you. This finding fits with what is observed when diagnosing autism. Another fascinating, complicating factor about autism is that in addition to reducing functionality, it can add incredible functionality too. Autistic savants are people with a diagnosis of autism with extraordinary abilities in specific areas like maths, music, art, or memory. About 1 in 10 people with autism have savant-like abilities, and they're really isn't a good explanation for why this happens, probably because there isn't a good explanation for why any autism happens. Effective management of autism is highly individualized, aiming to support the person's learning, communication, and their well-being rather than eliminate their autism. A combination of therapies, educational strategies, and sometimes medication can be used to support an individual. Also, support should look to build on the person's strengths and interests, not just focus on the challenges they have and their deficits. With the right environment and understanding, many individuals with autism thrive and have success in every single aspect of society. Another consideration is cultural variation in how autistic traits are expressed and understood. Tools like the DSM-5, they were developed in Western settings, and so it's important for clinicians to consider the cultural communication differences when they're making their diagnoses. I wasn't really sure whether to mention this, but just to quickly add that some people have concerns about a connection between the MMR vaccine and autism. This is all due to a completely discredited 1998 study that claimed a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. The study involved 12 people with no control group, and their medical histories were intentionally altered to fit a narrative, and the guy who published it was funded by lawyers preparing a case against the MMR vaccine, and for this reason and many others it was retracted fully in 2010. Additionally, this study on 537,000 children showed no association between MMR vaccine and the development of autism. This study looked at over 1 million children and found no evidence for increased risk of autism with the MMR vaccine. And this study looked at 657,000 children and found the same thing. We don't know exactly what causes autism, but it's not the MMR vaccine. This video is already mega long, but just to mention one small fascinating study that tried fecal microbiota transplants. So they transferred gut bacteria from a neurotypical donor into a person with autism with gut problems. They found not only better digestive health, but also some lasting improvement in behavior and autism criteria. It's also worth remembering that various psychological traits associated with autism exist on a continuum, and where we draw the line for diagnosis of autism is somewhat arbitrary. Some argue that the threshold has been lowered in recent years, which could explain much of the rise in diagnoses, or the rise could be due to increased awareness, better access to assessment, and changes in diagnostic practice. I don't know where the exact truth of this lies, but I think they are probably all a bit true to some extent. Making these videos takes a lot of time, and if you want to support this content, please consider subscribing as it helps the YouTube channel out loads. You can also buy me a one-off coffee or become an ongoing supporter by joining my Patreon. Links for both below. These are all of the people who have bought me a coffee, and also a massive thank you to my first Patreon, Abby. She's actually my amazing sister, but still counts. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions. I can reply to all comments because this channel's small, and I'll see you in the next one.